our core group member, Nieves Fernandez. Nieves. You're muted, Nieves.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning, Nieves.
I have chosen the first prayer by Brian Darcy, thinking in that there is a tendency in the Catholic Church on put more value to pain than joy. We are taught since we are children about offer sacrifices and pains and things to God to make him happy, forgetting that the first thing that God created was paradise, and that the first miracle that Jesus did was to change water into wine. So the poem, it's a prayer. It's called The Duty to Be Happy. Make your mind to be happy. Learn to find pleasure in simple things. Make the best of your circumstances. No one has everything, and everyone has some sorrow mixed in with the gladness of life. The trick is to make the laughter outweigh the tears. Don't take yourself too seriously. Don't think that somehow you should be protected from the misfortunes that befall other people. Don't let criticism worry you. You can't please everybody. Don't let others set your standards. Be yourself. Do the things that enjoy more. Don't borrow trouble. Imaginary things are harder to bear than the actual ones. Do not cherish enmities. Don't hold grudges. Hatred poisons the soul. Have many interests. If you can travel, read about many places. Don't spend your life brooding over sorrows or mistakes. Don't be one who never gets over things. Do what you can for those less fortunate than yourself. And keep busy at something. A very busy person never has time to be unhappy. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Nieves. Now I'd like to ask our core group member, Joe Mulvaney, to please introduce our two speakers today. Joe, over to you.
Good morning, Ireland. Good evening, Australia, and a very good day to you all. I came through All Hallows Seminary from 1963 to 1970 and worked in Texas as a priest, then met this beautiful woman and came back here. And we've been active in the church and in church reform since that time. But all of us are centered, in this meeting, we're centered very much on Vatican II and the decades since then. Here in Ireland, there have been a number of groups and individuals and priests who have been trying to ensure that the vision of Vatican II was implemented and that the reforms and changes needed would be brought about. It has seemed a very difficult job, and we're not sure how much success have been achieved, but we've all been working at it here. So it's great to hear as well about Peter Wilkinson and David Timbs, who are involved with a group called Catholics for Renewal on the other side of the world, based in Melbourne, Australia. So they are presumably operating since 2011 more or less like our groups here. We are Church Ireland, the Association of Catholic Priests. So presumably, and they seem to have the same objectives, to make it a more Christ-like church, and more to bring about the reforms in terms of equality for all, power sharing, and ministry, equal ministry for women in the governance and leadership of the church. So they seem, just reading about what they've been doing in Australia in the years since 2011, they seem to have been involved in responding to the child abuse crisis, whether it was in institutions or whether it was clerical abuse. And they seem to have been involved in trying to come up with answers and improvements in state systems, state laws, church protocols. So that's been a big part of their work. And now, since 2016, the Australian Church, as we understand it, have embarked on towards an Australian Plenary Council or an Australian Synod. So they're working a few years ahead of us, because we in Ireland are now just embarking on that process as well. So the Catholics for Renewal in Australia, with Peter and David, seem to have produced a booklet or a book outlining what they regard as the key reforms and renewals that are needed in our church. And of course, that's of huge interest to us to learn from them. So it's a privilege and a pleasure for all of us to gather, to meet and greet those men, to learn from them, to listen from them, and about what they are doing and experiencing in Australia. So I am delighted to introduce to you Peter Wilkinson and David Timbs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Peter will begin this evening's presentation, if you can call it that. It's a friendly chat, I think, is probably better described. But I'd like to begin with a quote from a book by Louise Milligan, an Australian journalist who wrote a book in 2017 called Cardinal, The Rise and Fall of George Pell. I'm sure you all have heard of George Pell. Right at the very end of that book, Louise records an interview she had with Bishop Bill Morris. You've probably heard of him too. He was invited by Pope Benedict in 2011 to resign. He's told Bill, it's God's will for you to resign after 19 years of being bishop. Bill was a perspicacious character. He knew what was going on. And I think this quote, his own words, gives you some idea of why we are where we are right now in the church in Australia. Bill Morris. People are just not going to take the garbage they did from us before. We bishops have let down our people. We need to give our people a voice. We have let down our own people. Now there is a whole new mission we are on about. It's about getting relationships right. We've been good at power, good at dictating the way people act, but we have not been good at relationships. We have protected our power and destroyed our relationships. Summarizes where we are. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, David, and great to meet you, everyone. We've got a little outline of this conversation, and the first thing, or the first section I want to talk about is the history of our councils. This plenary council that we're having starting this year is called the 5th Plenary Council of Australia. Actually, it's the 7th, because the first 2 plenary councils weren't called plenary councils, they were provincial councils, because at that time, up until 1874, there was only one province. So the first 2 actually covered the whole of Australia. they were convened by the first Bishop of Australia, an English Benedictine bishop called John Polding. Now, Polding had a particular vision for the church in Australia. He thought that the church in Australia should be one great, big, single cathedral abbey, over which he, as the abbot, would preside, and that the monks would elect all the bishops in perpetuity, who would be Benedictine abbot monks. Now, that was never going to work, of course, but Polding didn't get it, as they say nowadays, and he continued on his way with that whole vision destined to end up in the garbage heap. Now, Polding also wanted all the priests that were coming from Ireland, all the priests from All Hallows and the other colleges, seminaries in Ireland, to become Benedictines once they landed on Australian shores. Now that, of course, was destined for disaster as well. So, in short, the Irish bishops, who were gradually gaining the ascendancy, set about to undermine Polding. And once Cardinal Paul Cullen was in charge of Dublin, he set about using his connections in Rome to have appointed a series of Irish bishops. 12 of them were either his nephews or relations or cousins, and the others were his students. So he acted as the patron for a whole group of Irish bishops that would gradually take over the whole of the church in Australia. The next plenary council, which is officially called the First Plenary Council of Australia and New Zealand, was convened by Patrick Cardinal Moran, who was the nephew of Cardinal Paul Cullen. Now, Moran had been the secretary of Cullen and worked very closely with him. So Moran understood the power of synods and councils, because he'd seen what had happened in 1850 with the Synod of Thurles, and also in 1875 with the Plenary Council of Maynooth. So when Moran was appointed as the Archbishop of Sydney, one of the first things he did almost as soon as he landed was to establish a plenary council. And his objective was to use this council to put in place his vision for the church in Australia. Now, his vision was first to have a united national Australian church modelled on the Irish church. And that's the Irish church, of course, was the Irish Roman church, because Cullen was an ultramontane. And like Cullen, he knew the power of councils, and he was going to implement those to implement his vision. He also wanted, through the council, to impose uniformity of practice, uniformity of discipline, with uniformity and authority paramount, and himself wielding that authority. He also wanted a national major seminary, similar to Maynooth, under his authority. He wanted to have diocesan control of all female religious who came to Australia. And he wanted to appoint predominantly Irish bishops whom he could bully and make do as he told them to do. Moran convened 3 councils in 1885, in 1895 and 1905. And by the end of the 19th century, Moran could probably say, like de Gaulle, l'Église, c'est moi. He was the powerhouse bishop in Australia, across Australia, and there was no one who could challenge him. And he ran the country, or ran the church, as though it was his private domain. And New Zealand was also part of that domain. The next council was in 1937. Now, by 1937, there was still hardly any Australian bishops. That's Australian-born bishops. And in that period, around 1937, after Moran had died, another Irish troika, a powerful troika, had grown up, and that was the troika of Mannix in Melbourne, Duig in Brisbane, and Killen in Adelaide. And those three took over the running of the church and moulded it to themselves until Rome eventually broke the troika up and gained control. Now, Australian bishops, since Vatican II, have really taken very little notice of Vatican II, especially on synodality. They don't want to listen to the faithful, and if they have to listen to them, they're fearful of having to act on what they hear. So their policy has always been, let's not have synods or councils, let's just have our conference of bishops where we can talk to ourselves, be separate from the faithful, and we'll run the country as we want. But the beauty of Episcopal conferences is that you can make all the resolutions in the world that this is what we're going to do. And then each bishop goes home to his own diocese and he says, well, that was a nice meeting we had, but I'm going to do it my way. And that's the usefulness and the uselessness of Episcopal conferences. From 1965, that's the end of Vatican II, to 2011, only 5 bishops have held a diocesan synod. So in 2011, when Catholics for Renewal was formed, the first things we asked for was, A, every diocesan bishop in Australia must hold a diocesan synod, and B, the ABC, the Australian Episcopal Conference, needs to convene a plenary council in 2015. Reform groups in Australia started to form as early as the 1980s. The first reform group was called Women and the Australian Church. It was a group mainly formed by religious women. The next group was a group in Sydney called Australian Reforming Catholics. The next one in 2003 was Catholics for Ministry, which has morphed into Catholics Speak Out. The next one was our group, Catholics for Renewal, in 2011. Then a website was set up in just outside of Sydney in the Blue Mountains called Catholica, which was a type of a talkback, if you like, website where the owner of the website presented a topic for the day, and then there was discussion on that topic on a daily basis. And that's been a very powerful influence in keeping alive and contemporaneous the thoughts of people about renewal. Another group that also was set up early, but wasn't an advocacy group, but rather an information group, was Spirituality in the Pub. I don't know if you have that in Ireland, but rather than have conferences and meetings in churches or church properties, this group decided that they would get people together in the pub, have a meal together, and then have a presentation by a guest speaker. Then in 2012, 3 groups, Women and the Australian Church, Catholics in Ministry, and Catholics for Renewal, got together and decided to establish a network, a coalition, to just make sure that they're integrated and in a way sort of form a peak body, if you like, to gain more influence. Since 2012, that group called the Australasian Catholic Council for Church, Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, has grown to 19 groups, including Christina's group in New Zealand. We also established international connections. So we made connections with Catholic Church Renewal International in the US and International Catholic Reform Network, with which I'm sure you're quite familiar. The agenda for reform and renewal in Australia has centred initially very much on doctrinal change regarding ordained ministers. So in 2008, Catholics for Ministry put out a petition calling, saying that there was a major crisis in ministry. There was no doctrinal barrier to the ordination of married men, and practical steps needed to be taken towards ordaining suitably qualified men. It encouraged the role of women in ministry. It encouraged discussion on the question of women's ordination. It wanted appropriate training programs to prepare both men and women for ministry. And it also wanted priests who have left the ministry to return to active ministry. So this petition went out in 2008. It garnered 17,500 signatures from Catholic laity and clerics throughout Australia. And the response that they got to that petition and the 17,500 signatures was, sorry, it's beyond our competence. The next initiative focused very much on governance and structural change within the church. The group started asking for diocesan synods in every diocese, a plenary council in 2015 with strong representation from the laity. And again, the response from the ABC was the time is not opportune. We then, Catholic Renewal then started asking for diocesan pastoral councils in every diocese, mandatory annual diocesan reports, publication of all quinquennial reports, women to have equal roles in decision making. And Catholic Renewal did this through several open letters. The first one to the Pope and all the bishops in Australia. And the second one, we never got any response from Rome. So we focused just on the Australian bishops. We argued that the key governance principles that were necessary for reform were transparency in decision-making, accountability to the faithful, co-responsibility, and subsidiarity. Over to you, David.
A couple of items here on our approach to further approaches to reform in the Australian Church. And just to take up from where Peter left off, the number of unsuccessful drivers towards reform or action. Now, initially, when what became a tsunami of cases about child sexual abuse, clerical child sexual abuse, the bishops didn't act at all. Everybody knew, they must have known because they were covering it up for decades, but they were not going to do anything about it. Things changed dramatically when George Pell was Archbishop of Melbourne and the Premier of the state of Victoria, Jeff Kennett, knocked on his door and said, George, you fix this thing, or if you don't fix this thing, I will. So that caught George's attention. What caught George's attention and his colleagues very soon after that was the Parliament of Victoria called for an inquiry into child sexual abuse. And they issued a report called Betrayal of Trust. Now, this really got the bishops, that term, betrayal of trust, and it became almost a leitmotif of their hopeless performance during this whole disaster. Hot on the heels of the Victorian inquiry was the call for a national inquiry into child sexual abuse across all major institutions that had a duty of care for children. Now, this was triggered again by a wonderful woman, Therese McCarthy, who was a reporter for the Newcastle Herald. Newcastle, a big industrial city north of Sydney. And Therese, over the years, noticed this groundswell of cases coming before the courts involving priests. And she said, we've got to do something about this. And she called up the Prime Minister of the day and persuaded her to call a national Royal Commission. Julia Gillard was the name, the Prime Minister. Julia Gillard went into the Parliament and announced the formation of a Royal Commission. Now, it immediately drew cross-partisan support. And that Royal Commission was left open-ended. It actually went for 4 years, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was a turning point in the church in Australia. So there are two great women who were very great, to whom we're very grateful, Therese McCarthy and Julia Gillard. Also during this time, in the lead up to during the Royal Commission, the lead up to it, Catholics for Renewal sent in a very detailed, highly detailed submission. And it focused on not so much the disparate cases, if you like, or the casuistry of child sexual abuse by clergy, but the underlying issues, which were structural, systemic, and pertained to governance, or the dysfunctional dimension of governance among the bishops. And the Catholic desk at the Royal Commission picked up that submission, and they went to the president, or the head judge of the commission, Peter McClellan, and advised him to see us. So 3 of us flew to Sydney, and we had 90 minutes with Justice Peter McClellan, and suggested to him that the best way to tackle the whole problem of clerical child sexual abuse was not to look at the whole string of how many institutions were to blame, but what was going on underneath it all. And invariably, it was a question of what we call dysfunctional governance. And the brother and sister of dysfunctional governance are cultures of secrecy, of obfuscation, of power, in this primitive honor-shame culture that was at work, certainly in the Catholic Church. Now, as a result of that representation, the direction of the Royal Commission changed almost immediately. Now, eventually, Peter Wilkinson got a call from a publisher here in Melbourne, and he asked us to write up that submission in book form, and here it is. Okay, it's called Getting Back on Mission, Reforming Our Church Together. So there it is, our submission. Okay, where are we up to? We're better gallop. A number of other, quickly, another list of, or a number of unsuccessful drivers to action were the problems of the collapse of the parochial system, the loss of the collapse in vocations to the priesthood, religious life. In 1960, there were 1,400 seminarians. In 2000, there were 250. A huge number of religious and priests were brought in to keep things going on a parish level. Over half the number of priests serving in parishes in Australia now are overseas born. And they're here mainly on contracts, limited time, and then they go home mostly. So this has enormous implications for the long-term survivability of parishes, because there's a loss of continuity and identity. Also coupled here were the dramatic decrease in mass attendance. 1954, 74% of Catholics in the country were regular mass goers. By 2016, it was down to 12%. Practice of the sacrament of penance is down to about 1%, and it's probably zero after the plague hit us recently. Successful drivers in the movement towards action in reform of the church were ultimately the Commission or the inquiry in Victoria, the Royal Commission, and the patent problem of bishops' credibility nosediving. Archbishop Coleridge, in an interview with the BBC a couple of years ago, said that our credibility is shot to pieces. Nobody believes us anymore. The bishops in Australia are on the nose. Politicians don't want to know them, and their own people don't want to know them because of the betrayal of the church. A couple of years ago, Bishop Long, a Vietnamese refugee, now bishop, one of our heroes, said, our bishop's reputation, our moral credibility, our trust capital are effectively destroyed in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis, and which in itself is a vestige of the old tribalist, clericalist, insular, self-sufficient, self-contained fortress church. So there, that's what it's all about. A whole lot of other things there we could quote. I'll pass this on to Peter now, but just a little note about one of the things we've found very effective in our advocacy is to collect quotes from bishops. Anything they say that can help your advocacy is like collecting diamonds because they can't ignore them. Okay, so that's we've got bookloads of quotable quotes. So Peter, would you like to?
Thank you, David. Eventually, when Pope Francis started advocating for more synodality in the church and started modelling it with the Synod of Bishops, our illustrious Archbishop Coleridge went to one of those synods, and one day when the bishops were eager to get out to have a plate of spaghetti for lunch, Pope Francis stopped them in their tracks and said, just hold a second, I just want to say a couple of words to you. And in that little talk that he gave them, a fervorino, he said this: synodality is not some of the bishops meeting some of the time. It is all of the people meeting all of the time. And that little statement of Francis had an enormous impact on Archbishop Coleridge. And he came back to Australia and he saw the light and he said, we must have a plenary council. Now, our bishops here in Australia are divided right down the middle between conservative and ultra-conservative bishops and progressive and middle-of-the-way bishops. And when they had the last election of the president of the Bishops' Conference, the vote was 20 votes to Coleridge and 20 votes to the conservative Archbishop Fisher, one of the Pell appointments or appointees. The only way that Coleridge gained the ultimate election was of seniority of ordination. So eventually Coleridge was able to get the bishops to agree to hold a plenary council. Catholics Renewal had asked for one in 2015. We were told that the time was not opportune. After about 2 or 3 years of negotiating by the bishops, eventually they decided that they would launch the plenary council in 2018, which they did. Now, when they launched it, one of the things that Coleridge said was everything has to be on the table. One of those quotes that David and our group have used constantly to remind him that all the difficult issues have to be on the table. So they decided that there would be this plenary council starting in 2020 and that there would be 2 sessions. The first in Adelaide in 2020 and the second in Sydney in 2021. With COVID, that has been changed. So the first session will be in Adelaide in October of this year, 2021, and in Sydney next year in 2022. When they decided to hold the council, they elected the president. He wasn't appointed by the Pope. He was elected by the bishops themselves, and they elected Archbishop Costello of Perth. A middle of the roader, neither conservative nor particularly progressive, but good steady hands. They also set up a organisational structure, which in Ireland they may reproduce. That is, they set up a Bishops' Commission with 5 members, an advisory commission, a committee with 14 members, mostly lay people, and a facilitation team with 3 members. 2 of them were lay. And the preparatory stage was launched at Pentecost 2018. Now, since the launch, there has been a number of what's been called phases, all within the preparatory stage. So the first phase, which went on for 10 months, was called the listening and dialogue phase. Now, in this phase, all the faithful in Australia and other Christians and non-Christians were invited to respond with written submissions to this simple question. What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? What do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? By the deadline for submissions, 17,500 had been received. 4,700 from individuals and 12,800 in group submissions. And shortly afterwards, a final report analysing the submissions in terms of issues and themes was produced by the National Centre for Pastoral Research. The second phase was called listening and discernment, which again went on for 10 months. Now, what the organisers did with the 17,500 submissions and the analysis, they distilled all that material down to what they call 6 national themes. And those themes were the subject of further discernment. And they selected a number of people for 6 writing groups, and those people were put to work to write working papers on the national themes. At the same time as that was happening, the National Centre for Pastoral Research also produced individual reports for each diocese. That is what the submissions from the various dioceses had put together. And those reports were far more insightful into what people had actually said than the final report, because the diocesan reports gave them weightings. So the weightings were what was the most widely discussed issue in your diocese. And I did an analysis of those and came up with the top 20 most discussed themes that had been presented in those submissions, which were very, very different, quite different from what had come up in the national discernment themes. The discernment papers or working papers were published when they were published, there wasn't huge enthusiasm for those documents, but they became a key resource for the instrumentum laboris. There has been some reports that there was bullying in those discernment groups. One archbishop refused to add his name to one of the documents. The general feeling amongst the reform groups that they weren't particularly helpful, or they didn't really move the church or the preparations for the council into a stage where you could say, it's very clear now what the objectives are. The next phase, phase 3, was the call of the participants for the council. Now, instead of having a national process for this call, individual dioceses were allowed to use their own process. By and large, the processes that the diocese used was very opaque. No one knew exactly what was happening. It was all very controlled. Out of it, 257 persons were called from the various dioceses, 35 with a deliberative vote and 223 with a consultative vote. But the thing that really struck Catholics Renewal and others was the bishops decided to call these people who were called delegates. They deliberately called them delegates because it gave the impression that these people were being sent by their local bishop or their local diocese to represent the diocese and the bishop. So it gave the impression that these delegates were answerable to their own bishop and to their own diocese, whereas in fact, their authority didn't come from any delegation. Their authority to participate in an act of governance came from the call by the president of the Plenary Council. Now, since we raised objections to this use of the word delegate, and recently, when the statutes and regulatory norms for the council were published, it was very clear that Rome thought the same way as us and said, no, they cannot be called delegates, they must become members. They must be called members of the council. Now, overwhelmingly, the members of the council are clergy, religious, and paid employees of the church. That was the outcome of this, what I think you could call a manipulated process. So the bishops, by and large, selected from their own diocese people whom they knew they could control in some way, because those people, particularly the lay people, owed their employment to the bishop and the diocese. Another thing we did at this stage was ask or urge the bishops to seek a dispensation from Canon 433. Now, this canon, I think, is going to be just as important to you as it is to to us. Canon 433 is a limiting canon. It puts a cap on the number of lay people and other religious, apart from the ones that have to be called, being called to the council. And the cap is very, very stringent. So what we were saying to the bishops is, when you're selecting the participants or calling the participants to be members, you need at least 1/3 of all the members to be women, 1/3 minimum. And that was impossible under the strictures of Canon 433. So we urged the bishops, get a dispensation so that you can appoint more lay people and especially more women. And in fact, they did that, and they were given a dispensation to call an extra 40 people, most of whom have been women. The statutes and regulatory norms were prepared by the Bishops' Conference without any consultation of the faithful. Again, something you and Ireland might like to consider. Don't let them get away with not consulting you about the norms and statutes. And they were approved by the Holy See last November. Since the statutes have been approved, the bishops have now, or the president has now published a revised list of members, and it now totals 280. They're no longer called delegates, they're called members. 39 of them have deliberative votes, that's the bishops or their equivalent only. 241 have a consultative vote. 52% of all the members are clerics, 48% are lay people, 67% are male, and 33% are female. Overwhelmingly, all of them, including the clerics and the lay members, are employees of the church in one way or another. So far, we haven't seen the details, the background details of these members. They've also been called representatives of the diocese, but no contact details have been provided for them. And what we have said, or what we're saying in our latest editorial, is uncontactable representatives is an oxymoron. Over to you, David.
Okay, just a couple of words about one of the negative impacts of the COVID crisis on the Synod. The Synod was envisaged to have 2 live sessions where people would gather in 2 cities, Adelaide and then Sydney. Now, the process has been switched for the first session, which will be virtual to a large extent, intermodal. Some of it will be like this. There will be opportunities perhaps on an ecclesiastical province basis to get together. That's all the dioceses in one province, or in dioceses themselves where people can get together. I say it's unfortunate that the whole synod cannot take place live, because one of the insights that Francis had in calling the Bishop's Synod on Family was this: he did away with the talk fest. John Paul and Benedict let bishops talk their heads off and let them go. Nobody took any notice of them, and the popes didn't have to act because the conclusions had been written up 6 months beforehand. It was just a gab fest. So Francis was not going to have any of that. What he did was to rewrite the rules, and he said, especially with the Synod on the Family, look, there are big issues here about divorce, remarriage, homosexuality, etc., a whole raft of things affecting every family. So everybody has to be a partner in talking about these things and not just getting up on a podium and having 4 minutes of fame. So what he did was to revert to the magic of the circle. So you had people like Cardinal Ray Burke sitting next to somebody he wouldn't talk to in a fit otherwise, some little person from the other end of the earth. Everybody had equal voice in the circle. And Francis laid out a questionnaire. These are the issues. What would you do personally in your family when this issue came up? And he forbade the bishops to give sermons or talks. They had to speak from the heart, speak personally about how they would deal in a family, in their own family, with these issues of marital breakdown, etc., divorce and remarriage, communion for the divorced, homosexuality, etc. And it shifted the game. The whole dynamic of having people sitting in a circle on an equal basis, no matter who they were, talking about these enormous problems, which are in canon law often and in doctrine intractable. What do you do with intractables? And Francis's wisdom was, the people of God work these things out. That's where the Spirit is active. Things get worked out. So you had this marvelous document at the end of it, Amoris Laetitia. And he takes up some of the most intractable issues that you can imagine, which caused uproar, because Francis said from his own experience in the favelas, in the peripheries of the big cities in Argentina, that the people in those places lived the most knotted up lives you can imagine, but they worked things out. And they came out of all of that at peace with God. So Francis became a great believer in the primacy of conscience and the ability of people under the guidance of the Holy Spirit using their conscience to work things out. Now, this terrifies the hell out of bishops because they've got no control over people's conscience and they've got no control whatsoever of the Spirit. This is an ancient problem. If you read John O'Malley's History of Trent, you'll see the terror that was stricken into the hearts of the bishops there. He called it horror concilii, the horror of the council, because it takes on a life of its own. Now, there's something primitive, a primitive fear among the bishops of losing control, of letting people have their say. And I'm sure that's part of the power crisis. And so the history of the way that bishops have behaved themselves in the last couple of years has been appalling. Their behavior has been shocking. Stonewalling, obfuscation, manipulation galore. As Peter just pointed out, they've stacked this synod with fellow travelers, with employees of the church. But all we can do is think, well, the Holy Spirit's going to be there too. So maybe if people start talking on a level playing field and talking from the heart, then things will shift. But just to give you an idea of the governance, these shoddy governance of the bishops, the former head of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council was set up by the bishops during the Royal Commission, Francis Sullivan. He said the bishops have refined the use of inertia as a tool of management. Another friend of ours, John Warhurst from Canberra, he said, dealing with the bishops is like mud wrestling with an elephant. So just be warned that the same fun is ahead of you. What else do we got? One of the last things that I'd like to say is that one of the things that we really need to keep in mind in keeping our confidence up and belief in ourselves are the words of John Henry Cardinal Newman in his famous tract on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. In it, he warned bishops in particular not to think that listening to people, listening to their people, was some kind of act of charity, that it was gratuitous, that it was a concession. Poor little people, I'll lend them my ear. He said, no, they have a duty to listen. So we must insist on that bishops, any bishop who does not listen to his people is on very dangerous turf, very dangerous ground. And it's only, Newman went on to say that it's only in listening to their people that bishops actually know who they are. They only find their identity in having the people speak to them. The people define who they are. Newman says they won't even know what they're supposed to teach until they listen to the people. So the absolute necessity of the bishops here or in Ireland or anywhere else to listen to their people. If they don't, nothing will happen. and it'll be one of the great sins, the original sins against the Holy Spirit. Here endeth the lesson. Peter, is there anything else that you?
Yes,
Need to
just
wrap
this.
up?
At the moment, we've just had the Instrumentum Laboris. This is the document before the agenda. That's just been published. Catholics Renewal took a very good look at this document. It's very lengthy, and our conclusion was that it was a major disappointment. It really didn't prepare the way for an agenda that would make real change and real renewal in the church. The next thing that document will come out will be the agenda itself. Now, we think that that's probably been approved at last week's meeting of the Episcopal Conference. That will go off to Rome if it hasn't gone off already. And once it's been approved, that will be published. Once the agenda has been published, then the Plenary Council can be officially called and convened, and the members in due course will come together, as David said before, in a multimodal way. Now, one of the things that Catholics Renewal will do is, as soon as that agenda is published, we will examine it very, very carefully and make our judgment on what we think it's worth and publish our consideration. Then there's just a couple of other things that will precede the council. That is the preparation of the members of the council. They'll, during June and July this year, they'll be inducted and be prepared. A whole set of advisors, experts and consultants will be appointed by the Bishops' Conference. A number of guests, mostly bishops from regional Episcopal conferences around Asia and Oceania, will be invited to participate, but neither the advisors nor the observers will be able to vote. They may be able to speak if invited. And then, of course, as David said, we start the council in Adelaide. That there will be a formal ceremony there with the liturgy, but it will be multimodal with these provincial hubs. But we don't know the detail at this stage. The second session will be in Sydney. I think it's July. Again, we don't know how that will go, but we have some concerns that we're raising. One is the voting process, and the other is the oath that people may have to take. Now, these will be very important for your council in Ireland. We have a voting process, but under the voting process at councils, say, for example, the consultative voters, the 241 consultative voters decide that mandatory diocesan councils should be mandatory. Unanimous vote. Now, we know our bishops in Australia don't want to have diocesan pastoral councils because they limit their freedom. So it's quite possible that the bishops may decide that they will vote against the consultative vote, the unanimous consultative vote. Now, under the rules, the consultative vote is not binding on the bishops, on the deliberative voters. What we're saying is, okay, we accept that, but if you're going to vote against a unanimous vote of the consultative voters, you must publish your reason or reasons for doing so. Now, the feedback we're getting from the bishops is, no, we're not obliged to do that. So that's important, I think, for you to know that you want them to publish the reasons, because in the past, when decisions have gone to Rome, Rome has often overturned the decision of the deliberative voters. And that was particularly the case of Mary MacKillop, who founded the Josephite Sisters. The bishops voted 14-3 to have each diocesan bishop control the sisters. Rome overturned that 14-3 vote and decided that Mary's congregation should be one of pontifical right, whereas she had control over the whole of her congregation. The other thing that we're very concerned about is the oath. Now, under canon law, everyone who participates in a plenary council, including the observers and the advisors, must take the oath of fidelity. Now, that oath covers a whole range of things, including fidelity to the deposit of faith, not speaking against anything that is against the deposit of faith, and so forth. Now, we notice that the feedback that we've got from you, Colin, is that the German members of their synodal way are not obliged to take the oath. Now, that may be a device that they've used to make sure that they're able to discuss any issue that they want. In Australia, under the statutes and the Instrumentum Laboris, what the bishops have been saying is, look, a lot of subjects are not up for discussion because they're part of the magisterium, part of the deposit of faith. And we can't be discussing anything to do with questioning that. And that's what I think they're going to do at this plenary council. The synodal way doesn't impose the oath on people, so they've got much more liberty. So take that into consideration when you're planning your council. Then there's the celebration stage goes through, they publish all the acta and decreta, that's sent off to Rome. Usually it takes a year, sometimes longer, to get approval for Rome. Rome often requests clarifications, amendments, or even overturns decisions. But ultimately, an approval will come in some form or other. And then it's the council itself that decides when the laws of the council, and they are the laws of the council, not the laws of Rome, will be promulgated and how they will be promulgated. That law is valid and binding on every bishop and every diocese in Australia. No bishop can dispense themselves or their diocese from plenary council legislation, which again is very different from the German synodal way. The German synodal way will reach decisions, they'll make laws, but those laws are not binding on bishops, individual bishops, and the individual bishops can dispense themselves from the laws made by the synodal way process. David.
Yeah, just to follow on a little bit from Peter's observations about the oath. I read it carefully and I did a bit of analysis of some of the language, and it draws heavily from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 90, and also a lot of the stuff rather insidiously comes straight out of a letter that Pius X wrote to the French hierarchy called Vehementa Nos. And in it, he says to the French hierarchy, of course, we live in what is called an unequal society. We have the leaders at the top, the sacred, the ordained, those who are set apart, Then we have the people who follow. And it is the duty of the people who follow to do precisely that, to be unquestioning in their obedience. Now, the language of this oath is straight out of that. And also it comes out of the personal oath of loyalty to the Führer. Pretty dangerous stuff. In fact, there are a couple of, it's a very clever use of dodgy language to control people. This language of the deposit of faith, what on earth is that? What is the deposit of faith? We've been having informal chats about challenging the bishops to tell us what is in the deposit of faith, to distinguish between core teaching and the rest. But when you look at it, the only things that are core are the creed, and they're still arguing about them. There's nothing that isn't being still argued about. So what is this deposit of faith? And it brings up questions of conscience. It's like signing something you don't understand. This is rather dangerous stuff. It also says, I shall follow and foster the common discipline of the entire church. What the hell's that? The common discipline of the church. And I shall maintain the observance of all ecclesiastical laws. Well, big call, and especially those contained in the Code of Canon Law. I mean, this is a real ambit claim. But getting back to the deposit of faith and all of that, all this stuff is just thrown up. And what do you do with it when it's people have to actually put their hand on a Bible and swear on this thing? And it is all very dodgy stuff. But we're told that by our canon lawyer advisor that this particular oath that we have before us is kind of light on compared with the oaths that have been put before people in the past. And he said, if we object to this, we'll attract even more opprobrium from on high. But this is another example of a control mechanism using language which is despicable, wouldn't stand up in a court of law, wouldn't get past the patent office. Well, by the way, I made a mistake too. This book that we produced is the submissions to the plenary, not the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. Okay. I got ahead of myself.
David and Peter, can I thank you there for that? You've absolutely mind-blowing, the insights you've given us as to the situation in Australia, and so highly relevant for our situation here in Ireland. I'm conscious we've sort of run over on time because we wanted to hear from you, and what you had to say, as I said, was extremely relevant. If anybody wants to ask a question, if they could please use the hand signal. Patricia, you're joined first there. You far away, please.
I just want to